Welcome to the CJN Daily.
Nice to be here. Thank you very much for having us, Victoria.
Yeah, thank you.
As a Jewish illustrator, how did you feel working on this project? Like, what did it mean to you?
I mean, I'm both a Jewish illustrator and also happened to grow up in this city. So it was a little surreal to sort of go back in a lot of parts of the city, areas that I grew up in, and sort of see it through a very different lens, both sort of looking at it from very different era than the era that I grew up in the city, but also, yeah, I mean, it really is a strange experience to sort of visit these places that feel very familiar and see it in the context of this very tense time period, encountering some of the hate speech, some of the tensions that were going on at the time is a little surreal when that was not how I was viewing the world growing up, and it sort of recontextualizes things a little bit, but also kind of strengthens my feeling of connection with this city, with some of the community that I grew up in, sort of knowing that this is the history, this is sort of what led to my own experience that I had growing up.
What made you make the decision to tell the story from the perspective of children?
Well, I'm primarily a writer of books for kids of all ages, from young adult novels to nonfiction to picture books for very young children, and it seemed a really good way in. Also, just for this kind of story, I think 1933 was probably even a more gut-wrenching year or sort of era to live in than our own past few years, and how that must have felt as you're on sort of the cusp of adolescence and feeling so desperate to find opportunities to want to help your family, to be involved in the world, and at the same time not knowing what to do. It just seemed these were the characters who were best going to convey that story, because in a way they're the future, they embody the future. At the same time, they're also, because of their age, because of entrenched prejudices and just societal norms at the time, they're also completely shut out from ways of supposedly from ways of making things happen. There's just all these things happening. And of course, at the same time, much like today, world events are just burgeoning out of everyone's control as Hitler comes to power in Germany, and people in Canada are getting, in retrospect, seemingly bizarrely mixed messages about what was going on there, what's to be believed, what can be done. If you're 12 or 13, I just thought that had extra resonance. You're not going to hop a freight. You're not going to do sort of the grapes of wrath. You're going to be stuck in your neighborhood and trying to cope with this on a micro level and getting drawn into the macro.
I think there's also something really powerful in just exploring what it feels like to be living through a moment in history, or sort of being involved in something that's just a little over your head. And that is only emphasized when you sort of are seeing it from the perspective of the young protagonists in this book. There's a real, I don't know, loss of innocence, but we see sort of the political awareness of these characters coming to life. They start out the book with very different priorities. They just want sort of a petty cash, and then by the end of it, they have become aware of this larger political world and social movement that they are a part of, and it's, I think, exploring that through the perspective of children makes it all the more affecting, I would say.
We also wanted it to be a fun book, even though it's
yeah.
such a grim.
This has become the theme of a lot of our interviews, is we have to, at the end, remind ourselves to say, this book is a fun adventure book. This is, as despite these heavy and very, very relevant themes, it's also hopefully an enjoyable read for someone just wanting a fun story.
As a result of the riots, though, Ted, your grandfather, William Stewart, kind of implemented what was the first, like some of the first hate speech laws in Canada. This was also like one of the biggest examples of ethnic violence that's happened in Canada. Why do you think that people don't know about this? Why do you think that it's not taught more?
I think Josh and I have talked about this on a couple of occasions, and perhaps he can add to this. I think partly it was that, as I mentioned before, 1933 was still in the worst of the Great Depression, and just the massive turmoil and sweep of events in so many areas tended to just subsume this story. I think it was something that clearly and importantly and rightly resonated within both the Jewish and Italian communities in Toronto at the time, because they were both very much outsiders and did stick together. But in the larger sweep of events, I don't think the sort of WASP Toronto, for want of a better term, or British Toronto, or whatever the case may be, fully recognized in a larger sense what had happened. I was, part of my research, I'm sorry, I'm just shuffling through, like for example, the chief of police, the Toronto chief of police at the time, who has elsewhere been termed the most incompetent and clownish chief of police Toronto ever had. Chief of police for 18 years. After this massive event that went on for hours, all these people involved, his summary of what happened the next day to the press was, Hebrew people arrived and caused trouble. Let's just lift the rug and sweep this under. And, my grandpa tried to have him fired on several occasions, but, there were powerful interests in the city that were not invested in change, and they just wanted this minimized. And so, given how media functioned at the time and who had the levers of power, that's what became of the story. That's my take on it anyway. And it's only much later that we start to realize that how important an event this was, and this people standing up for themselves, and how shocking and striking that should have been. But how often in history do we not realize the importance of an event until we have a different frame of reference, a different context later on? So it's certainly not the only thing that has been ignored in Canadian history.
I think it also is sometimes not or at least historically hasn't been talked about as much. We're sort of glad that there's a bit more of a spotlight on it now, because it is a hugely significant moment in Canadian history. But I think it's also a moment that runs a little counter to the narrative that as Canadians we sort of like to advertise, this idea of the great Canadian multiculturalism, which is very much worthy of celebrating. But I think that it's also worth acknowledging that multiculturalism, it's an ongoing process. It is something that you have to continually work towards, and that is I think a harder truth to advertise, at least. So because of that, I think moments like this don't get talked about as much as I'd say should be.
Do you guys have any plans coming up for the anniversary with your book?
I'm lucky enough to live close to the pits, so even though we don't have a formal sort of book planned for it, I'm definitely gonna probably visit the pits on the day and just at the very least take a stroll around it, and think about what happened here, back in 1933, however many years ago that was at this point. But yeah, no, we haven't ended up coming up with any book plans. It's been tough this year with the pandemic to make any sort of major plans at this point, and some of our planning that we might have had around the anniversary has been a little bit the victim of that.
Yeah, well, let's see what's due on 16th, Josh. Maybe I'll meet you at Christie.
That could be kind of fun, actually.
It might be. It might just be. I'll see if I've got a ball glove.